This is MF Galaxy, your weekly webcast of writers on writing, pop culture, politics, and Afrocentricity. Featuring your host, the political, poetical, transformational, sensational, sinister Minister Faust. Webcast around the world from ministerfaust.com and mfgalaxy.org. On today's episode,
the way that Howard created his Conan's world, I saw immediately that I could take this African background that I had and do the same kind of thing. I also had a character, Imaro, who was not, if there had been no Conan, there wouldn't have been an Imaro because I would have never thought of it, but it was a different kind of African hero. Imaro was the person that I wished would just jump out in those Tarzan movies and beat the crap out of Tarzan. Every Tarzan movie, he was just beating up hordes of black people. But just once, right? Somebody like, say, Jim Brown or Muhammad Ali or somebody like that would jump up and waste this dude. Imaro was the person who could do it.
That's Charles R. Saunders, the groundbreaking founding author of the genre called Sword and Soul, which employs the mythic structure of Eurocentric sword and sorcery inside an African-based fantasy setting. As you're about to hear, Saunders' innovation arose in response to the profoundly racist dimensions of North American publishing, especially inside fantasy. Born in Pennsylvania in 1946, Saunders achieved a degree in psychology before moving to Canada in 1969. He lived in Ottawa for 14 years and since 1985 has lived in Nova Scotia. He's been a community college teacher, research assistant, civil servant, journalist, editorialist, and copy editor. Never one to let anyone stop him, Saunders has authored 7 novels including Imaro, The Quest for Cush, Dossouye and Abengoni First Calling, and 4 books on African-Nova Scotian history, including Sweat and Soul, the Saga of Black Boxers from the Halifax Forum to Caesar's Palace, Spirit of Africville, Share and Care, the story of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, and Black and Bluenose, the contemporary history of a community. This episode's conversation comes from deep inside the catacombs of the Grand Lodge of Imhotep. It's a never-before-aired interview we recorded by telephone on August 10th, 2008. In it, Saunders discusses why he came to Canada, how he achieved an Afrocentric point of view, why young African Americans and African Canadians liked science fiction in the 1990s despite how much the genre excluded or even mistreated them, the racist imagery inside science fiction and fantasy, including in Robert Heinlein's novel Farnham's Freehold and in J.R.R. Tolkien's classic The Lord of the Rings. Contemporary authors of Afrocentric science fiction and fantasy that Saunders admires, such as Nalo Hopkinson, Nnedi Okorafor, and Carol MacDonnell. What it's like to be told by Euro-North American publishers that African North Americans don't read, and the troubled publishing history of his own classic work, Imaro. And now on MF Galaxy aired for the first time, my August 10th, 2008 conversation with Charles R. Saunders. So, why did you come to Canada?
Well, I came to Canada in 1969 at the age of 23. I think it's kind of clear. I came because of the Vietnam War, which I received an invitation to participate and I declined.
Now, you could have gone back under the amnesty granted by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, but you chose to stay.
Actually, it was Ford's. It was a kind of under-the-table amnesty by Ford. What they did was anybody that they really didn't want all that badly, they would dismiss. The government would just dismiss the case. So the case against me was dismissed in federal court before Carter even got to office. I call that stealth amnesty. Carter did have an amnesty, it's just that his didn't apply to me.
How was it that you came to what I would at least call, and you can debate the term or you can substitute your own, but from what I would see it, how did you come to an Afrocentric point of view, at least in terms of what you wanted to accomplish in your writing?
It was a kind of collision between the black consciousness that was going on in the States during the late 60s. That was a great time to be young, in the late 60s. Everything was changing and everything seemed possible, and there was this whole upsurge of pride in being black, whereas before the best you could do was apologize for it or excuse it somehow. but this pride started coming out. So that was one thing. Another was that I went to a historically black university, Lincoln in Pennsylvania. They had a collection of books on African history, culture, and so on. I started getting into those, reading those, and they helped to shape my consciousness. Then I was also reading a lot of fantasy and SF at the time. Let's say that the depiction of blacks in those genres was not all that great. There were a lot of stereotypes in there. I could have just decided not to even bother with it, but I thought, I saw that there was plenty of potential for using these other things that I was learning and putting that into the genre. I had always been into writing anyway, just didn't have a focus for it. So that became my focus.
You referred to the potential that science fiction and fantasy offered. Tell me about that, as particularly in relation to African characters and African audiences.
Those genres, fantasy and science fiction, they're really connected to something that we humans have been doing ever since we became human thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, which is to tell stories, right? To exercise our imagination. There were all kinds of African folk tales, myths. They have cycles of stories that are just, they match anything that you could find out of Europe, like the King Arthur and the Iliad and Odyssey and so on. I thought that I could bring that to both the black and white audience. Well, anybody, really. If somebody once asked me, what's the audience you would like to have for your books? And I said, anybody who can read.
Well, and I suppose additionally, hopefully, anybody who can pay for it, too.
Yeah, I'm not like Abby Hoffman, steal this book.
You've wrote one particularly famous essay and followed it up with a sequel, the first being Why Blacks Don't Read Science Fiction, and the second one appearing in the collection Dark Matter, Why Blacks Should Read and Write Science Fiction. When, in the early 1990s, I was on a use group called Alt-Soc African American, I asked the question, who was interested in science fiction, and I was quite amazed. Now, it was... although it was an American group, several of us on the group were Canadians or from other countries. And what I found was that so many young Africans in North America, raised in this time of political hip-hop, resurgence of interest in Malcolm X, and a lot of wonderfully Afrocentric things, so many people loved science fiction. And, of course, I did. At the time, it didn't really dawn on me, why are so many of us so devoted to a genre that has, as you have pointed out, historically treated us so badly, or simply ignored us, which is another form of mistreating us?
Well, if you're talking the early 90s, I think that it's very possible that things like, say, Star Trek might have helped, because there were some really strong black characters in Star Trek, such as Commander Sisko and so on. One of the few positive reference points back in my day was the original Star Trek, because every red-blooded black and I suppose white male in America had the hots for Lieutenant Uhura. It was just small things. Like Star Trek did, not just with Lieutenant Uhura, she was not just a token. They had other pretty interesting black characters, too. It was like, hey, here's finally something that at least gives us credit for being around in the future.
Well, I know one character who always struck me as having particular power in that regard was Richard Daystrom in
right.
Yes, in The Ultimate Computer, who was the most brilliant computer scientist of the 23rd century. The role was written in an entirely race-neutral way, which made it even more powerful that he was simply, nobody regarded it as odd that he could be such a brilliant mind.
Yeah, so there were these slim glimmers, right? Slim glimmers of hope, something that you could kind of get your hand on. There just wasn't a lot of it, though, but I think that we're getting to, today, to almost a critical mass, right, in terms of people who are involved in SF and fantasy. It's black people who are really interested in it. There's that group that you and I both belong to, the Black Science Fiction Society.
An online group.
Yep. I joined it in April, and I was the 61st member. Now, at the beginning of August, it's just about cracking 200. It's growing by leaps and bounds.
And it's a group made up of writers as well as people who are sharpening their craft to try to become professionals and fans.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, I'm a bit surprised that the group hasn't grown larger. I'm happy to see it, but some groups are 3-5 months into their existence are in the low tens of thousands.
Well, we are still a minority.
Now, you alluded before to what was being done wrong in the original text days of science fiction, and I'm looking forward to you describing to me what's being done better right now. But for folks who are less familiar with the genre, perhaps with reference to some of the genre's most well-known names or examples you find particularly striking, could you tell me where science fiction and fantasy did a bad job in the work that you saw prior to the 90s?
I start with the progenitors, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan, the whole negative image of Africa, right? 99% of what he wrote about Africa and Africans was bad. You get SF positing futures in which people are, say, more accepting of aliens with a green skin on Mars than human beings with black skin on Earth. Robert Heinlein, who is one of the giant icons of the time, wrote a futuristic novel called The Farnham's Freehold, and in that, a group of people, contemporary people, were somehow propelled forward in time to an era in which the world was now run by black people who had created a much higher technological civilization than the one of the 1950s. And the reason that the blacks were able to do that was that the whites wiped each other out in a nuclear war. In fact, it was an atomic bomb in that war that somehow pushed these other people forward. So the first half of the book is them adjusting to their new surroundings. There's Farnham and his family, they're all white, and there's this one black servant of Farnham's. You get a kind of guess who's coming to dinner kind of vibe there, where the black is struggling for acceptance. And then they are discovered by the advanced blacks who now run the world. They're taken captive, the whites are treated like blacks used to be treated, and their black friend is taken into this society. So tables turn, role reversal. All of this is probably sounding pretty good, right? But there is something about this super advanced black society, which is that they are cannibals. Like Heinlein somehow juxtaposes very badly the idea that if left to themselves, blacks could create a civilization as good or better than the white one. And along with that idea is, but they still can't outgrow their savage past.
And this was written at a time when the prevailing belief in certainly white American society was that the African continent was actually full of real-life cannibals.
Yep, yeah. So, Heinlein was saying it was like he couldn't take the final step, right? He couldn't get rid of all of whatever stereotypes were in his mind. I know I've spoken at length about that, but it was something that really, when I first read the book, it affected me in a very negative way. I thought, what is wrong with this man? And this is one of the giants of the field.
Yes, in fact, when I think of the authors whose work inspired me when I was a youth and when I was a child, that would have included Heinlein and Daniel Keyes, later on Frank Herbert and Philip K. Dick. And really, although at least in Herbert's case he's making a partial, although highly qualified case for Arab nationalism, in none of these writers did I encounter anything but what you might call extras. Not even supporting roles, but very, very minor roles for African characters. So it was a future in which we didn't exist. And as a friend of mine pointed out about even the original Star Trek, he said, I wonder when was the race war that annihilated almost all East Asians, because other than Mr. Sulu, they were almost entirely absent as well, and remain so.
Yeah, that's true. Hadn't thought of that.
A few years ago, there was a great deal of discussion, at least in some circles, about not the books, but the recent Peter Jackson adaptations of Lord of the Rings and their take on race. Did you have any thoughts on that at the time or now?
I'm sorry, I have to talk about the books, but in the books, Tolkien was criticized a lot for making his evil characters black, especially the writers, But I didn't see that as being black in the sense of Africans, right? Even though Tolkien spent a few years of his childhood in South Africa, it was more like these people were like the color of charcoal, which no human being is. I mean, even the darkest of black people, their skin is not the color of, say, charcoal or oil or something like that. So I think it was just using black as the synonym for evil. In the movies, the orcs and the other characters just look inhuman, right? They didn't look black. So it wasn't even a matter of race, right? It was more like they were different species.
Well, let me throw a few things at you, and then you can tell me where you might think that this is unfair or going too far. The casting, of course, for the films was almost exclusively people of European descent, except for notably the Uruk-hai, who had thick lips, or strong lips, to use a less loaded term, and strong noses as well. They were literally born from the mud, which reminded me a little bit of the neo-Nazi term mud people. You had Gandalf rousing his troops, "O you men of the West," arrayed against, in the second film, bad guys riding elephants, which certainly suggests people of South Asia, and some who were wearing turbans, and I think even some who were bad guys who had what looked like Maori war paint. So it seemed that, although obviously there were evil white characters, that if there were characters who suggested that they were colored people of some background on the earth, they were uniformly bad. Do you think that that's an unfair take on the films?
No, I wouldn't call that unfair. It's just that it's not quite so blatant. It's like it's not, say, the bone in the nose kind of stereotype, but it is there, right? I'm not going to say that it was not there. Maybe I'm getting mellow as I'm older, but it just didn't leap out at me the way that it is definitely leaping out at you. I guess with me it was more like it crept out rather than leapt out.
Yes. Now, let's talk about some positives, and you have noted that there's a critical mass. What are some of the examples, and I will ask you to tell us about Imaro shortly, unless I'm getting the pronunciation wrong. Is it Imaro or Imaro?
In my mind, it's Imaro, but Imaro, that's the way most people pronounce it.
All right, well, I'll try to follow the canonical version, Imaro.
Okay. It's a one-man canon. I'm the only one who pronounces it that way.
So, what are some of the examples of work either by African writers or non-African writers who've just done a really good job of presenting African characters and situations?
In the former category, you've got some really great stuff coming out now. There's Nalo Hopkinson, who is a Canadian like us. I am not sure how to pronounce her name. It's, wait a minute, I'm just going to go over here.
Is this Tanana Reeve-Douay?
I was going to mention her, but also Nnedi Okorafor Mabachu. Right, she's done really great work. Carol McDonnell has done great work. It's as though in the past 10 years or so, more really good black writers are being published. Now, for all I know, there could have been a lot of people who had tried before and never did get published. I don't know. All of us were in kind of isolation years ago. None of us really knew of each other's existence, but then things started changing. I mean, I remember going to SF conventions where I literally was the only black person there, unless you count somebody wearing a Darth Vader costume.
I don't think that one counts.
No, not unless James Earl Jones was in it.
Well, this is an interesting situation you're describing because there have been various waves in American publishing when African writers have had a good shot. Male writers in the 1960s in particular, and then several people have described a kind of a shutting out of those writers in the beginning of the Reagan years, and then a burst of opportunity for women writers, African women writers in the United States, particularly in the mid-'80s and 90s. But in all of these cases, there continue to emerge stories where African writers have said that white publishers and editors have told them, well, black people don't read books. And that might sound to some listeners as if I'm being extreme, but I mean many, many writers have said this is what they were told pretty much word for word. And yet, this recent boom of black science fiction fantasy writers suggests that either there are black editors and publishers at these publishing houses, or that there's a new breed of white editors and publishers. What's your take on that?
I don't really know what's going on in that regard in publishing, among publishing houses. I think that what we're getting is a different stream of publishing. In the old days, the major publishing houses had their best sellers, which they, and the revenue from that would carry along what was called the mid-list, which is like below the radar screen as far as bestsellers go, but still pretty solid. New people that they could help to finance. When big corporations started taking over the major publishing houses, they couldn't care less about the mid-list or the beginners or the people that they would wanted to take chances on. So this left kind of a vacuum for the type of book that is not going to sell like gazillion number of copies, but still will have a pretty loyal and solid audience. So other publishing houses began to exploit that particular niche, which was left empty by the corporations that took over the big houses. Now, that's putting it a little simplistically, and it doesn't really answer your question because I don't know who is behind all of this. But I think that these people who are the publishers who are going after what used to be the mid-list and are trying to fill that niche, they're the ones that are more open to something different, including black writers and including finally getting it through their heads that, yes, black people do read also.
Even with the emergence of some African, in this particular case, American writers of science fiction who've done very well, and I'm thinking in particular of Walter Mosley, who's not exclusively a science fiction writer, of course, but nevertheless, writers such as you, Stephen Barnes, Nowell Hopkinson, and me also, have managed to do something that Mosley hasn't done, which is to have Africans on our book covers. And that is, my understanding is that seems to be one of the barriers that white publishers don't want to cross. They seem to feel that if they put black folks on the covers, they're going to lose white readers.
Well, just maybe my own experience would point in that direction, unfortunately. But I do have to tell you one thing. This is not about me. I'll get back to me in a minute because I know you're going to ask about it. But
yes.
Stephen Barnes had this, looked like the beginning of a series, Zulu Blood, Lion's Heart. Yeah.
And these were about alternate Earths in which Africans rather than Europeans were triumphant.
That's right. The cover of the second book, and I keep mixing the titles up. I think it's Zulu Heart. Yeah, it was Lion's Blood was the first one. Zulu Heart was the second. It depicted the main character who is an African American in this other universe where the blacks rule and the whites are slaves. He was on the cover, and he was depicted as a white man. Yeah, didn't even have a suntan. Yeah, the man was white. And he has two wives, right? One of them did look fairly close to what she was supposed to look like. The other one looked white, too. I'm not saying, not like Sherry Belafonte or Beyonce. This woman looked white.
Right.
And that book came out in, I think, 2003, and it begged the sequel. You knew there was going to be a sequel, but it never came. I don't know for sure, but it could be that Stephen Barnes got so upset because of the way that cover was depicted that he decided not to even bother. Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask him, but that's my hypothesis there. Okay, now do you want to ask the question about my experience, or should I go right into it?
Well, you go right ahead, since you've already you've driven us right up to the door, so just open it up.
Right on. Okay, here we go. When my first let's just a little background on Imaro. What I write is what's called sword and sorcery, although I now call it sword and soul, right? It's my own version of it. But sword and sorcery, I guess, is Conan, that kind of thing, where you have, it's a modern interpretation of the hero myths of old, right? Most sword and sorcery is based on one character, such as Conan. The other kind of fantasy, like Tolkien's, is more based on events, in which the characters are kind of subordinate, Anyway, I had absorbed quite a bit of African background. The way that Howard created his Conan's world, I saw immediately that I could take this African background that I had and do the same kind of thing. I also had a character, Imaro, who was not, if there had been no Conan, there wouldn't have been an Imaro because I would have never thought of it, but is a different kind of African hero. Imaro was the person that I wished would just jump out in those Tarzan movies and beat the crap out of Tarzan, Every Tarzan movie, he was just beating up hordes of black people. That just once, right? Somebody like, say, Jim Brown or Muhammad Ali or somebody like that would jump up and waste this dude. Imaro was the person who could do it. Back in 1981, Daw Books, which was and still is a mainstream science fiction fantasy publisher, agreed to publish my first Imaro novel. They had an idea in mind that I didn't know about at the time. Imaro is a black African. That's what he is. The setting that I developed for him is sort of an alternate Earth Africa rather than one of our own past. It takes some of the elements of our past. Of course, I felt great that this book was going to be published. Right? I mean, who wouldn't? It was just fantastic. Then I received a proof of the cover, and all of a sudden it wasn't so fantastic anymore because, number one, underneath the title Imaro, the subtitle was The Epic Novel of a Black Tarzan, and the way that the artist depicted Imaro did look like Tarzan with a suntan. Now, I wasn't too happy about that, and I let the publisher know it. But the editor of Daw at the time told me was that he didn't think that the book would sell with an identifiably black character on the cover. And they were using this black Tarzan thing as a sales gimmick. Sales gimmick didn't work out because the people who held the copyright on the real Tarzan, i.e. the family of the creator Edgar Rice Burroughs, weren't too happy about that either, as you can well imagine. They threatened to sue, so the production, my book was supposed to be out in September 1981, but it got pushed back a month because they had to change the cover to get rid of the Tarzan reference. But, this was almost 30 years ago. Now, what's changed since then? The second and the third books, because I had raised so much hell, the second and third books did have an identifiably black version of Imaro on both those covers. Those two books sold a lot less than the first one, and actually all three of them ended up selling not so good, so that's why the fourth book, which I had written in the mid-1980s, never got published. Now, let's fast forward to a few years ago, through circumstances that would take me a long time to talk about. Another publisher, Nightshade, which was one of those new publishers I was telling you about, that was trying to step in where the other ones had gone off, where the big ones had gone off. They were happy to bring back Imaro, and they were happy to put an identifiably black version or depiction of Imaro on the covers of the first two books, which I had done some revision on. Anyway, there was none of this nonsense, this crazy marketing idea that Daw had back in 1981. So 2 years ago, 2006, the first Imaro novel came out, and then last year, the second one came out. I was looking forward to the third one coming out this year, but deja vu, Nightshade said they couldn't continue either because the sales weren't all that great. And it's sometimes a case of cognitive dissonance, because there are people like you and many others who really like my work, but publishers say, it doesn't sell enough, I can't keep printing. But now here's what all of this leads up to. When the publisher at Nightshade was telling me what was going down, he said that a reaction that he got from a lot of distributors, bookstores, and so on was, well, I don't think people are going to want to buy this, because really, if you look at all of the covers of the books that are on the shelves now, all this big racks full of fantasy, well, you look at that, and then you look at this, and, well, people, customers think that, or readers think that fantasy is a white realm. What had really changed in 25 years? Well, one thing was that Nightshade had a lot more sense than Daw did, but is that, I thought to myself, is that what it's really all about? And not only, it wasn't just the white booksellers that were saying that, so were the black ones, because I had suggested, try to get this into black stores. They'll love it. Well, no, not necessarily. I've got nothing against Western-oriented fantasy. I've got no problem with it at all. It's just that people who read it are supposed to be people who have more fertile imaginations, shall we say. And if you've got a fertile imagination, or a broad imagination, why does the boundary of that imagination stop at the places that you've mentioned? I think it's going to be a long, hard slug. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think progress is definitely being made, and there are other ways to publish and distribute books. There's non-conventional ways. It's the route that I'm taking, and I'm going to bring out the rest of my Imaro novels.
That was my conversation with author Charles R. Saunders from a never-before-aired interview recorded by telephone on August 10, 2008. Saunders is the author of 7 novels, including Imaro, The Quest for Cush, Dossouye and Abengoni, First Calling. To learn more about Saunders and his work, visit mfgalaxy.org for the links. You've been listening to MF Galaxy, your weekly webcast of writers on writing, pop culture, politics, and Afrocentricity. I'm Minister Faust, your host, and I produce this show at the Grand Lodge of Imhotep in Edmonton. Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com provides the music. Coming up next episode of MF Galaxy.
Doing a television series, it's it's easy, it's possible to fall into the rote aspect of it. I certainly recognize that I fell prey to that. I took the gift that acting is a bit for granted after all those years on Next Gen. And so I appreciate the gift that acting is with new eyes these days, with a fresh perspective. It feels pretty good.
That's LeVar Burton on the next episode of MF Galaxy. I'm Minister Faust, wishing you Noob, Woman, Eman.